Prepare yourself to hear an uncomfortable truth, stripped of ideology, excuses, and emotional anesthesia. Venezuela did not collapse by accident. It did not implode because of simple mismanagement, bad luck, or some abstract foreign conspiracy. Venezuela became a narco-state because organized crime was deliberately absorbed into the structure of political power, not as a side effect, as a system. When we talk about a narco-state, we are not talking about drug trafficking merely existing within a country. That happens almost everywhere. A narco-state is something far more serious. It is when the state stops fighting organized crime and starts protecting it, facilitating it, profiting from it, and ultimately depending on it to stay in power. In Venezuela, drug trafficking is not a parallel problem. It is part of the regime's operating logic. This process always begins the same way. A political project decides to systematically dismantle the institutions that limit power. An independent judiciary, a free press, professional armed forces, autonomous police, border control, and financial transparency. Chavismo destroyed these pillars gradually and intentionally. When institutions disappear, power loses all restraints. And when power has no restraints, it looks for money outside the law. As Venezuela's productive economy collapsed, the private sector was crushed, and legitimate state revenue dried up. The regime needed new sources of funding, not to improve people's lives, but to keep political elites, military leadership, and loyal bureaucrats in line. That is when drug trafficking stopped being fought and started being tolerated, then protected, then fully integrated. Geography played a decisive role. Venezuela became one of the main drug transit routes between Colombia, a historic cocaine producer, and markets in Central America, the Caribbean, the United States, and Europe. What used to be clandestine routes began operating with state protection. Aircraft take off from illegal runways without interference. Ports are used with official complicity. Borders are crossed with the help of authorities. None of this happens without command. None of it happens without hierarchy. None of it happens without participation from the top. Multiple international investigations, testimonies from former regime insiders, intelligence reports, and formal indictments point to the involvement of high-ranking Venezuelan military officers in international drug trafficking. The term "cartel of the suns" did not appear by coincidence. It refers directly to the sun insignias worn by Venezuelan generals. This is not corruption at the bottom. This is structure at the top. When armed forces begin profiting from drug trafficking, they stop being national defense institutions and become armed organizations serving a criminal enterprise. Loyalty shifts away from the nation and toward illicit cash flow. This explains why the regime survives despite total social collapse. At this stage, ideology no longer matters. Survival does. The socialist, anti-imperialist, pro-people rhetoric functions as camouflage. Behind the speeches, the regime operates like a criminal organization that controls territory, eliminates rivals, represses dissent, and protects illegal routes. The difference between a traditional cartel and a narco-state is simple. In a narco-state, the cartel has a flag, embassies, and a moral narrative. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans live in brutal conditions. Food shortages, lack of medicine, energy blackouts, constant insecurity. Millions have fled the country. Yet the regime does not fall because it no longer depends on the population's well-being. It depends on territorial control, armed force, and illegal revenue. When a government reaches this point, its relationship with society stops being political and becomes purely coercive. Another key feature of Venezuela's narco-state model is the deliberate destruction of the legal economy to strengthen the illegal one. The more informal the economy, the more dependent people become. The more dependent they are, the easier they are to control. Drug trafficking thrives precisely where the state eliminates opportunities for honest and independent work. Crime becomes the only functional economy. The Venezuelan regime has also built alliances with other illegal and authoritarian actors. Armed groups, guerrillas, smuggling networks, money laundering operations, and regimes hostile to the international order. These alliances are not ideological, they are transactional. Their purpose is to evade sanctions, move money, protect routes, and ensure regime survival. Sanctions, by the way, did not create the narco state. They came later. Drug trafficking was already embedded in the regime before any major sanctions were imposed. Sanctions simply accelerated dependence on illegal activities. When access to the formal financial system is restricted, corrupt regimes rely even more on dirty money. That deepens the criminal cycle. Understanding this is essential to avoid falling for the simplistic narrative that everything can be explained by economic mistakes or foreign interference. What happened in Venezuela was the replacement of a failed state with a functional criminal state. Functional for those in power, not for those living under it. This also explains why the regime refuses free elections, rejects political alternation, and blocks real reforms. It is not just fear of losing office. It is fear of losing protection. A government sustained by crime cannot step down, because stepping down means facing national and international justice. That is why repression is relentless. That is why censorship is aggressive. That is why opponents are imprisoned, exiled, or silenced. This is not a normal political dispute. It is the survival mechanism of a criminal structure. Calling Venezuela a narco state is not rhetorical exaggeration. It is a technical description. Drug trafficking is not a side effect of the system. It is one of its pillars. Denying this is repeating propaganda. Ignoring it is willful blindness. And this reality matters far beyond Venezuela's borders. Narco states export violence, corruption, transnational crime, and regional instability. They do not remain contained. They infect neighboring countries and weaken entire regions. The lesson is clear and unavoidable. When a government destroys institutions, concentrates power, eliminates accountability, attacks economic freedom, and presents itself as the ultimate savior, the result is never social justice. The result is unlimited power, and unlimited power always ends up merging with crime. Venezuela is not a distant warning. It is a concrete example of what happens when ideology becomes a shield, corruption becomes a method, and the state becomes an accomplice to organized crime. If you want to understand politics beyond propaganda, if you want to see how regimes actually operate when no one is watching, share this content. Subscribe to the channel. Support analysis that exposes real power structures instead of comforting narratives. We do not romanticize regimes here. We explain how they function. Because understanding reality is the first step toward not repeating it.